The dust-laden wind whipped through Grace Porter's auburn hair as she stood at the edge of Castle Dome, Arizona territory, watching the life she'd built crumble before her eyes. Behind her, a crowd of angry townsfolk clutched torches and scowls, their judgment hanging in the air heavier than the desert heat of 1878. Sheriff Holloway's voice boomed over the crowd. "You've been warned enough times, Miss Porter. Castle Dome has no place for a woman who can't keep her opinions to herself." Grace clutched the small leather satchel containing the few possessions she'd managed to grab before being escorted to the town limits. At 24, she'd spent 2 years teaching at the town's modest schoolhouse, but her progressive views on women's education and her vocal opposition to the corrupt mining operations had made her powerful enemies. "You'll regret this," Grace called back, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "The truth doesn't stop being true just because you banish the person speaking it." Sheriff Holloway spat on the ground. "The Prescott Mining Company brings jobs and prosperity to this town. Your wild accusations and filling children's heads with nonsense about women deserving the vote, it stops today." The townsfolk murmured in agreement, though Grace noticed a few downcast eyes among the crowd parents whose children had flourished under her care, women who had quietly supported her evening literacy classes. But none stepped forward to defend her. "You have until sundown to be out of sight," the sheriff warned, "or I'll have you arrested for trespassing." Grace lifted her chin, refusing to let them see her cry. She turned her back on Castle Dome and began walking toward the vast, unforgiving desert. The spring sun was already high, beating down mercilessly. She had enough water for perhaps a day, and no clear destination in mind. The nearest settlement was 30 miles away, an impossible journey on foot in this heat. She walked until the sounds of the town faded, until Castle Dome was just a smudge on the horizon. Only then did she allow herself to sink to the ground, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Everything she'd worked for gone. Her small collection of books for the children, her plans for expanding education in the territory, her hope of making a difference all vanished because she'd refused to hold her tongue when faced with injustice. As the reality of her situation settled in, Grace wiped her tears and took stock. She had her teaching credentials, a change of clothes, $17.43, a small knife, a canteen half full of water, and the journal where she documented the mining company's violations, dumping toxic chemicals in the water supply, underpaying workers, bribing officials. Evidence that had made her dangerous. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her scramble to her feet. A rider was coming from the direction opposite Castle Dome. Grace tensed, hand moving to her small knife. Travelers in this region weren't always friendly, especially to a woman alone. The horse and rider materialized from the heat waves rising off the desert floor. A tall man astride a chestnut quarter horse, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. His clothing was dusty but well-kept denim trousers, a faded blue shirt, and a leather vest. Not the typical garb of the bandits who sometimes plagued these routes. He slowed his horse as he approached, keeping a respectful distance. "Madam," he said, touching the brim of his hat, "Yates Eastwood at your service. Don't mean to alarm you, but it's mighty unusual to find a lady out here alone." Grace straightened, keeping her knife visible. "I'm perfectly fine, Mr. Eastwood." He raised an eyebrow, his gaze taking in her schoolteacher's dress, inappropriate for desert travel, and the small bag at her feet. "Begging your pardon, but you don't appear fine. Castle Dome's that way," he gestured behind her, "and there's nothing but 30 miles of hard country between here and the next town." "I'm aware of the geography," she replied tersely. His lips quirked slightly at her tone. "I see. Well, then you must have a mighty good reason for heading out here without a horse or proper supplies." Grace hesitated. This stranger could be dangerous, but her options were limited, and there was something in his straightforward gaze that didn't feel threatening. "The good people of Castle Dome have asked me to leave, permanently." Yates Eastwood studied her for a long moment. "Wouldn't happen to be because you spoke your mind about something they didn't want to hear?" Grace blinked in surprise. "How did you know?" A small smile crossed his sun-weathered face. "Call it an educated guess. Castle Dome's got a reputation. The mining company practically owns the place, and they don't take kindly to folks stirring up trouble." He dismounted, movements fluid and careful, still keeping distance between them. "What exactly did you say that got them so riled up?" Grace's fingers tightened around her knife. "I spoke the truth. About the mining company poisoning the water, about the children getting sick, about the workers being cheated out of fair wages." Yates nodded slowly. "And I'm guessing you've got proof in here," she tapped her satchel. "Records, dates, testimonies from workers who were too afraid to speak publicly." He let out a low whistle. "No wonder they ran you out." He glanced at the horizon where the sun was beginning its descent. "Look, Miss Porter, Grace Porter, Miss Porter. Night falls fast out here and it gets cold. My ranch is about 10 miles east. I can offer you shelter for the night, and tomorrow we can figure out where you might go next. Or," he added, "you can take your chances with the coyotes and rattlesnakes." Grace weighed her options. Trust this stranger or face almost certain death in the desert. "How do I know I can trust you, Mr. Eastwood?" His eyes met hers directly. "You don't. Just like I don't know if I can trust that the papers in your bag won't bring trouble to my door. But I give you my word as a gentleman that you'll be safe at my ranch. And," he added softly, "at my place, you can speak freely. I promise you that." Those words, "speak freely," struck Grace like a physical blow. How long had it been since she'd been able to speak without censoring herself? "Without calculating the cost of her honesty, I accept your offer," she said finally. "But I want you to know that I'm not afraid to use this." She lifted her small knife. Yates Eastwood actually laughed, a warm, genuine sound. "I'd be concerned if you weren't cautious, Miss Porter." He extended a hand toward his horse. "Shall we?" Moments later, Grace found herself seated behind Yates on his horse, her satchel secured to the saddle. She kept a careful distance between them, holding the back of the saddle rather than his waist. As they rode, the landscape gradually shifted from barren desert to sparse grassland. Yates pointed out landmarks and plants, naming them as they passed. His voice was deep and measured, with the unhurried cadence of a man comfortable with silence. "Are you a rancher, Mr. Eastwood?" Grace asked as they crested a small rise. "Cattle mostly, some horses. Nothing grand, but it's mine. Been building it for 5 years now. Alone. Got a couple of hands who help with the herd. Good men. One's a Navajo fellow named Key, best tracker I've ever known. The other's Tobias, an old Buffalo soldier who decided he'd had enough of the army." Grace was surprised. "You employ a native man and a Negro." Such arrangements were unusual in the territories. Yates shrugged, the movement shifting his shoulders beneath his shirt. "I employ the best men for the job. Don't much care about the rest." The sun was setting by the time they approached a modest ranch house nestled in a valley protected by red rock formations. A small creek ran nearby, feeding what looked like carefully irrigated fields. Several outbuildings clustered near a corral where horses grazed. In the distance, cattle dotted the landscape. "Welcome to Eastwood Ranch," Yates said as they approached. As they rode into the yard, a tall black man emerged from the barn. "You're back early," he called, then stopped short when he spotted Grace. "And with company." "Tobias, this is Miss Grace Porter," Yates introduced as he dismounted, then offered Grace a hand down. "She's had some trouble in Castle Dome. She'll be staying the night." Tobias nodded respectfully. "Madam, I'll prepare the guest room." His eyes held questions, but he didn't voice them. "Thank you, Tobias," Yates said. "And can you ask Mrs. Wilkins to set an extra plate for supper?" After Tobias left, Grace looked questioningly at Yates. "Mrs. Wilkins is my housekeeper," he explained. "Lives in town but comes out to cook and keep the place from falling into complete disarray. She'll be heading back to her home after supper." The ranch house was simply furnished but comfortable, with solid wooden furniture and surprisingly well-stocked bookshelves. Grace couldn't help but run her fingers along the spine's history, law, science, even poetry. "You read," she observed, "when I can. Winters get long out here." Yates hung his hat on a peg by the door. "The guest room is down the hall. You can freshen up there. Supper will be ready soon." The guest room was small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a simple chest of drawers. Grace set down her satchel and poured water into the basin, grateful to wash away some of the dust of her journey. A soft knock at the door startled her. "Miss Porter, I've brought you some clothes that might be more comfortable." A woman's voice. Grace opened the door to find an older woman with gray streaked hair holding a bundle of fabric. "Mrs. Wilkins, I presume?" Grace smiled. "Yes, madam. These belonged to Mr. Eastwood's sister when she visited last year. Might be a bit large, but better than your travel-worn things." She handed over the clothes, a simple skirt and blouse in practical fabrics. "Thank you. That's very kind." Grace accepted the bundle. "Has Mr. Eastwood mentioned why I'm here?" Mrs. Wilkins pursed her lips. "He said you ran into some trouble in Castle Dome. That's enough for me to know. That town's been rotten since the mining company took over." She patted Grace's arm. "Supper in 20 minutes, dear." Dressed in the borrowed clothes, Grace made her way to the dining room, where Yates was already seated at the head of a sturdy oak table. He stood when she entered. "Those fit better than I expected," he commented. "Please sit, Mrs." Wilkins brought out a hearty meal of beef stew, freshly baked bread, and roasted vegetables. The food was simple but delicious, and Grace realized how hungry she was. "So, Miss Porter," Yates said after they'd eaten in silence for a few minutes, "you were a teacher in Castle Dome." Grace nodded. "For 2 years. I came west after completing my education in Boston. I wanted to make a difference." "Boston?" Yates raised an eyebrow. "That's quite a change." "My parents died in a fire when I was 16. I was raised by my aunt, who believed strongly in education for women. She died last year." Grace's voice softened with the memory. "She would have approved of my standing up to the mining company, even if it cost me my position." "Tell me about that," Yates said, leaning forward slightly. "What exactly has the Prescott Mining Company been doing as Mrs.?" Wilkins cleared the dishes and served apple pie. Grace recounted the events of the past months, the children falling ill with strange rashes and stomach ailments, the contaminated water, the miners developing lung diseases but being denied compensation. How she'd begun keeping records after noticing patterns in her students' absences. "The company doctor claims it's just normal childhood illnesses, but I've taught long enough to know the difference," she explained. "When I started asking questions, gathering information from the miners' families, the company management took notice. First came warnings from the school board, then threats. When those didn't silence me, they turned the town against me." Yates listened intently, asking occasional questions but mostly allowing Grace to speak without interruption. It felt liberating to share the full story without fear of repercussion. "The final straw came yesterday," Grace continued. "I organized a meeting of miners' wives to discuss their husbands' working conditions. The sheriff broke it up, claiming we were inciting unrest. This morning, the school board dismissed me, and by afternoon, I was being escorted to the town limits. With evidence that could damage the company, Yates noted, nodding toward her satchel, which she'd kept close throughout the meal. Yes, which is why they were so eager to see me gone. They know I have nowhere to take this information, no one who would listen. Grace sighed. The nearest newspaper is in Prescott, and they're owned by the same people who own the mine. Mrs. Wilkins, who had been quietly listening while cleaning up, spoke up. Begging your pardon, but that's not entirely true. There's a new paper in Wickenburg, independent sort. My cousin's boy works there. Grace and Yates both turned to her with interest. How far is Wickenburg? Grace asked. 3 days' ride, Yates answered. But getting your story to a newspaper might not be enough. The mining company has lawyers' influence. One newspaper article might not change much. Grace's shoulders slumped. Then what am I supposed to do? Just let them poison people, let children suffer? Yates was quiet for a moment, considering. There's a territorial judge I know in Prescott, Judge Hammond. He's honest, not in anyone's pocket. If you had your evidence presented properly as a legal case rather than just a newspaper story. I'm not a lawyer, Grace said. Yates smiled slightly. No, but I am. Or was back in St. Louis before I came west. Grace stared at him in surprise. This cowboy rancher had been a lawyer. It explained the books, his articulate speech. Why did you leave the law? She asked. A shadow crossed his face. That's a story for another time, but I still have my knowledge and my license is valid in the territory. He leaned forward. I could help you prepare your case, Miss Porter. Present it to Judge Hammond. It won't be easy, and the mining company will fight back hard, but with solid evidence. Hope flickered in Grace's chest for the first time since being forced from her home. You would do that, for a stranger. For justice, he corrected, then added with a small smile, and because I admire your courage. Not many would risk everything to stand up for what's right. Mrs. Wilkins cleared her throat. It's getting late. I should head back to town before full dark. She gathered her shawl. Mr. Eastwood, will you be needing me tomorrow? Yes, please come as usual, he answered. And Mrs. Wilkins, I'd appreciate your discretion about our guest, of course. Good night, sir, Miss Porter. She nodded and departed, leaving Grace and Yates alone at the table. Why would you risk helping me? Grace asked after a moment. The mining company could come after you too. You could lose your ranch. Yates's eyes met hers steadily. Some things matter more than land or cattle, Miss Porter. I learned that lesson the hard way. He stood. It's been a long day. We can discuss plans further in the morning. Grace nodded, suddenly aware of how exhausted she was. Thank you, Mr. Eastwood, for everything. Yates, he said. If we're going to be working together, you might as well use my given name. Yates, she repeated. Then I'm Grace. He smiled, a genuine expression that softened his weathered features and reached his eyes. Good night, Grace. Sleep well. That night, in the unfamiliar bed, Grace stared at the ceiling thinking about the strange twist her life had taken. Exiled from her home in the morning, sitting at a former lawyer's dinner table by evening, planning to challenge one of the territory's most powerful companies. And through it all, the memory of Yates's words echoed in her mind. Speak freely with me. For the first time in months, she felt like she could breathe. Dawn came early at Eastwood Ranch. Grace woke to the sounds of activity, horses nickering, men's voices calling to each other, the clang of metal tools. She dressed quickly in the borrowed clothes and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Yates already seated at the table, papers spread before him. He looked up when she entered, a smile warming his face. Good morning. I hope you slept well. Better than I expected, she admitted. You're working already, he gestured to the papers. Just reviewing some old legal notes. It's been a while since I practiced law. He pushed a mug toward her. Coffee, Grace accepted gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. So what's our plan? First, Yates said, we need to organize your evidence. Then I need to draft formal complaints to present to Judge Hammond. He hesitated. There's something else to consider. Your safety. Grace set down her coffee. You think the mining company might try to harm me? They've already destroyed your reputation and livelihood. If they realize you're building a legal case against them, they might take more drastic action. His expression was grave. I think you should stay here at the ranch while we prepare. I can't impose on you like that, Grace protested. It's not an imposition. It's the safest option. The ranch is remote, and between Tobias, Key, and myself, we can ensure no one bothers you. He leaned forward. Besides, I could use your help organizing the evidence. 2 minds are better than 1. Before Grace could respond, the back door opened and a Native American man entered, his movements silent despite his tall frame. He nodded respectfully to Grace before addressing Yates in a low voice. Riders coming. 3 men from the direction of Castle Dome. Yates stood immediately. Grace, this is Key. Key, Miss Porter. The introduction was hurried. How far out are they? 20 minutes, maybe less, Key replied. Yates turned to Grace, his expression serious. They might be looking for you. We need to hide you and your evidence. Grace's heart raced. How did they find me so quickly? Small communities, word travels. Mrs. Wilkins is discreet, but someone might have seen us riding yesterday. Yates was already gathering the papers from the table. Key, take Miss Porter to the root cellar, the one behind the smokehouse. Key nodded. Come, Miss Porter. Grace grabbed her satchel and followed Key out the back door and across the yard to what looked like a small storage shed. Behind it was a trapdoor built into the ground, nearly invisible among the weeds. It is dry inside, Key assured her as he lifted the door. And there is a lantern. Grace descended the rough wooden steps into a cool, earthen chamber lined with shelves of preserved foods. Key lit the lantern, casting the small space in a warm glow. Stay quiet, he instructed. I will come when it is safe. He closed the trapdoor, leaving Grace alone with her racing thoughts. Above ground, Yates and Tobias prepared to receive their unexpected visitors. They moved casually around the yard, Yates chopping wood while Tobias groomed one of the horses, acting as if it were any ordinary morning. The riders appeared exactly as Key had predicted, 3 men on horseback, dust rising behind them. Yates recognized the lead rider as Sheriff Holloway from Castle Dome. The other 2 were miners he'd seen in town but didn't know by name. Morning, Sheriff, Yates called as they rode into the yard. What brings you all the way out here? Sheriff Holloway dismounted, his hand resting casually near his holstered gun. Eastwood. We're looking for a woman, troublemaker from Castle Dome. Auburn hair, green eyes, pretty if you like the bookish type, calls herself Grace Porter. Yates set down his axe, wiping sweat from his brow. What's she done? Theft, for starters, Holloway said. Took some company property when she left town, important documents. Her own teaching records, more likely, Yates thought, but kept his expression neutral. Haven't seen any women out this way, Sheriff. It's pretty isolated. Holloway's eyes narrowed. Mind if we look around? Joe here says he saw you riding with a woman yesterday. One of the men nodded, heading this direction. Couldn't see clear who it was, but it was definitely a woman riding double with you. Yates shrugged. That was Mrs. Wilkins, my housekeeper. Her mule went lame in town, so I gave her a ride back. She's gone home now. Mrs. Wilkins is 60 if she's a day, Holloway countered. Man I talked to said this woman was young. Then your man needs better eyesight, Tobias interjected, his deep voice carrying across the yard. I saw Mr. Eastwood bring Mrs. Wilkins home myself. Holloway turned his attention to Tobias, contempt clear in his expression. Didn't ask you, boy. Yates stepped forward, his posture shifting subtly. Tobias is my foreman, Sheriff. You'll treat him with respect on my land. Tension crackled between the men. Finally, Holloway spat on the ground. We'll have a look around anyway. You got a warrant? Yates asked mildly. Don't need one. Pursuing a fugitive. A schoolteacher who spoke against a mining company is hardly a fugitive, Yates observed. But go ahead and look. Just stay out of the house without a warrant. The sheriff and his men spent 30 minutes searching the outbuildings and corrals, growing increasingly frustrated as they found nothing. Key had disappeared into the landscape, a skill that had kept him alive during years of conflict between his people and the U.S. Army. Finally, Holloway stomped back to where Yates stood waiting patiently. If I find out you're harboring her, Eastwood, you'll regret it. The Prescott Mining Company doesn't forget its enemies. Is that a threat, Sheriff? Yates asked calmly. Just a friendly warning. Holloway mounted his horse. Come on, boys. We'll check the Jackson place next. Yates and Tobias watched them ride away, waiting until they were well out of sight before relaxing. You think they believed us? Tobias asked. No, Yates replied, but they couldn't prove otherwise. Let's give it another hour before bringing Grace up, just in case they circle back. In the root cellar, Grace had heard muffled voices but couldn't make out the words. The waiting was excruciating, her mind conjuring scenarios where she was discovered, where Yates and his men were arrested for helping her, where all her evidence was destroyed. When the trapdoor finally opened, she nearly cried with relief at the sight of Yates's face. They're gone, he said, extending a hand to help her up the stairs. For now. Back in the house, Grace listened as Yates recounted the confrontation with Sheriff Holloway. They're claiming I stole company documents, she said, indignant. Everything in my journal is my own observations or testimony freely given by townspeople. They're desperate, Yates noted, which means your evidence must be damaging. He paced the kitchen. This changes things. We need to move faster than I thought. If they're already searching for you, they might try to discredit your evidence or pressure Judge Hammond. What do we do? Grace asked. Yates stopped pacing. I need to ride to Prescott tomorrow, speak with Hammond directly. Tobias will go with me. Key will stay here to protect you. I should go with you, Grace argued. It's my evidence, my case. It's too dangerous, Yates countered. If Sheriff Holloway or the mining company's men spot you in Prescott, they could have you arrested before we ever reach the judge. Then what am I supposed to do? Hide in your root cellar indefinitely? Yates's expression softened. No, you'll help me prepare the case tonight. We'll organize your evidence and I'll memorize the key points. Once I've spoken with Hammond and secured his protection, I'll come back for you. Grace wanted to argue further but recognized the logic in his plan. Fine, but promise me you won't soften any of it. The children's illnesses, the worker injuries, the contaminated water, all of it needs to be presented exactly as I documented it. I promise, Yates said solemnly. Every word of truth will be spoken. They spent the rest of the day and well into the evening at Yates's desk, Grace explaining each entry in her journal, each piece of evidence she'd collected. Yates took meticulous notes, asking insightful questions that sometimes led Grace to connections she hadn't previously made. You're good at this, she observed as midnight approached. I can see why you were a lawyer. A shadow crossed his face, was being the operative word. Grace hesitated, then asked softly, Why did you leave? If you don't mind my asking. Yates was silent for a long moment, staring at the papers before him. I defended a powerful man once, a railroad baron accused of negligence after a bridge collapse killed 12 workers. I got him acquitted." His voice grew distant. Later, I discovered he'd known the bridge was unsafe. He had inspection reports warning of structural weaknesses, but he buried them to save money. "That's terrible," Grace said. "What's worse is that I suspected it during the trial. But I didn't ask the questions I should have asked. I didn't look for evidence that might have incriminated my client." Yates looked up, meeting her eyes. "I won the case, but 12 families lost their loved ones and received no compensation because I did my job too well. So you left the law." "I left that kind of law, the kind where winning matters more than justice." He straightened the papers before him. "When I came west, I promised myself I'd never again use my skills to help the powerful crush the vulnerable." Grace reached across the desk and briefly touched his hand. "And now you're using those skills to help me fight for justice." Yates looked down at her hand on his, a complex emotion crossing his face. "It feels like making amends in some small way." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something electric passed between them. Then Grace withdrew her hand, suddenly self-conscious. "We should finish. You have an early ride tomorrow." By the time they completed their work, it was nearly 2 in the morning. The case was organized, the evidence compiled, and Yates had a clear strategy for approaching Judge Hammond. "Get some rest," Yates said as they parted in the hallway. "Key will keep watch. You'll be safe here." "Be careful in Prescott," Grace replied. "The mining company has eyes everywhere," he nodded. "I know how to be discreet." Then, with a gentle smile, he added, "Good night, Grace." "Good night, Yates." As she lay in bed that night, Grace reflected on how quickly her life had changed. 2 days ago, she'd been a respected teacher. Yesterday, an outcast facing death in the desert. Today, she was hiding on a ranch, working with a former lawyer to bring a powerful company to justice. And through it all, there was Yates Eastwood, a man who had offered her safety, respect, and the precious freedom to speak her mind. She fell asleep thinking of his eyes, warm and intent as he listened to her story, and the way his hand had felt beneath hers, strong and steady. The next morning, Grace awoke to find Yates and Tobias already preparing for their journey to Prescott. Yates wore a clean shirt and his least weathered trousers, looking more like the lawyer he once was than the rancher she'd first met. "We should be back by tomorrow evening," he told her as he gathered the documents they'd prepared. 3 days at most, if Judge Hammond requires extra convincing. "What should I do while you're gone?" Grace asked. "Stay inside as much as possible," Yates advised. "Key will keep watch, but it's better if you're not visible from the road." He hesitated, then added, "There are plenty of books if you get bored." Grace nodded. "I'll be fine. Just be successful." "I will." He mounted his horse, securing the saddlebags containing their carefully prepared case. "Remember, speak freely with Key. He's a good listener, even if he doesn't say much himself." With that, Yates and Tobias rode off toward Prescott, leaving Grace standing in the doorway of the ranch house, watching until they disappeared from sight. The day passed slowly. Grace explored the house more thoroughly, examining the books on Yates's shelves, law texts, history, philosophy, and to her delight, several volumes of poetry. She found herself wondering about the man who read Whitman and Thoreau in his spare time, who had walked away from a successful law career over a matter of conscience. Key brought her lunch and checked on her periodically, but didn't intrude on her solitude. Late in the afternoon, when the house grew stuffy, Grace ventured onto the covered back porch where she wouldn't be visible from the main road. She found Key there, carving something from a piece of wood with a small knife. He nodded at her approach but didn't stop his work. "May I join you?" she asked. He gestured to the empty chair beside him. "The air is good today." They sat in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the rasp of his knife against wood and the distant lowing of cattle. "How did you come to work for Yates?" Grace finally asked. Key's hand stilled briefly. "I was tracking a mountain lion that had been killing his calves. He was tracking it too. We found it at the same time." A small smile touched his lips. He said any man who could track as well as he could deserved better than government rations at the reservation. "Offered me work." "And you accepted?" Key nodded. "He pays fair, respects my ways, does not try to change me." He resumed his carving. "Like he does not try to change you." Grace looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" "Many men," Key said slowly, choosing his words, "want women to be quiet, to agree. Yates seeks truth even when it is not comfortable." He glanced at her. "This is rare." "Yes," Grace said softly, "it is." "He is a good man," Key continued. "Carries sadness but still tries to do right." "The railroad case," Key nodded. "And other things. Loss." He didn't elaborate and Grace didn't press. They fell silent again, but it was a comfortable silence filled with the sounds of the ranch and the steady rhythm of Key's carving. Later that evening, after a simple supper of beans and cornbread that Grace insisted on preparing herself, she settled in Yates's study with one of his books. The house felt different without him, emptier somehow, despite the fact that she'd known him only 2 days. "You're being ridiculous," she told herself firmly. "You're grateful to him for helping you, that's all." But even as she thought it, she knew it wasn't entirely true. There was something about Yates Eastwood that had captivated her from their first meeting, his quiet confidence, his willingness to listen, his moral compass. And yes, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, the strength in his hands, the resonance of his voice. "Stop it," she muttered aloud. "He's helping you with your case. That's all." The next day passed much like the first, though Grace found herself growing increasingly anxious as the hours ticked by with no sign of Yates and Tobias. By evening, she was pacing the front room, peering out the window at every sound. "They may need to stay in Prescott another night," Key said as he brought in more firewood. "The judge might be busy." "I know," Grace sighed. She was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching fast, too fast for a casual arrival. Key was instantly alert, moving to the window with the silent grace of a predator. "2 riders," he reported. "Not Yates and Tobias." He turned to Grace. "Hide, now." Heart pounding, Grace grabbed her satchel and followed Key to the back of the house. Instead of heading for the root cellar, he led her to what appeared to be a solid wall in the pantry. With practiced movements, he pressed a hidden catch, revealing a narrow space behind the shelving. "Yates built this when he first came," Key explained hurriedly. "For runaway slaves, then later for my people escaping the reservation roundups. Get in." Grace squeezed into the tight space, clutching her precious evidence to her chest. Key handed her a small pistol. "You know how to use," she nodded. Her father had taught her years ago. "Only if you must," Key cautioned. Then closed the hidden door, leaving Grace in darkness save for a thin line of light around the edges of the panel. Through the wall, she could hear the pounding at the front door, followed by men's voices, angry, demanding. Key's responses were too quiet for her to make out, but the intruders grew increasingly loud. "We know she's here somewhere. The sheriff authorized us to search the property. Step aside, Indian, or we'll move you ourselves." Grace's hand tightened on the pistol as she heard the sounds of a scuffle. A crash, as something was knocked over. Then a gunshot that made her jump, biting her lip to keep from crying out. Silence followed, so complete that Grace could hear her own racing heartbeat. Then footsteps, moving through the house, opening doors, overturning furniture. They were searching methodically, getting closer to the pantry. Grace held her breath as the pantry door opened. Through the crack, She could see a man's boots as he moved around the small space, pulling items from shelves, tapping on walls. "Nothing in here," he called finally and moved on. Grace sagged with relief but remained perfectly still. The search continued for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes. Finally, she heard the men leaving, their voices receding. Still, she waited, remembering Yates's warning about them possibly circling back. The line of light around the panel dimmed as the day faded into evening. Her legs cramped in the confined space, but she dared not move. It was fully dark when she finally heard Key's voice, soft but urgent. "Miss Porter, it's safe now." The panel slid open and Grace stumbled out, stiff and shaking. "Are you hurt?" "I heard a gunshot." Key shook his head. Fired into the air to scare them. They were mining company men, not lawmen, had no real authority. His lip was split, evidence of the scuffle she'd heard. "They are gone now, but will return with others." "We need to leave," Grace realized. "They won't stop looking." Key nodded grimly. "I will saddle horses. Pack only what you need." Within 30 minutes, they were riding away from the ranch, heading west rather than toward Prescott. Grace had changed into men's clothing that Key had provided a precaution against being spotted. Her hair was tucked under a wide-brimmed hat, her satchel of evidence secure inside her shirt. "Where are we going?" she asked as they put distance between themselves and the ranch. "There is a place in the mountains," Key replied. "An old trapper's cabin, few know of it. We will be safe there until Yates returns." They rode through the night, following trails invisible to Grace's eyes but clear to Key's expert tracking skills. The terrain grew increasingly rough, transitioning from grassland to pine forest as they climbed in elevation. Near dawn, they reached a small clearing where a crude log cabin stood nestled among towering ponderosa pines. It was primitive but solid, with a stone fireplace and shuttered windows. "Rest," Key instructed as he unsaddled the horses. "I will keep watch." Exhausted from the night's ride and the emotional strain, Grace didn't argue. She collapsed onto the cabin's single cot and fell immediately into a deep sleep. She woke to the aroma of coffee and meat cooking. Outside, the sun was high. She'd slept well into the afternoon. Key was tending a small fire in the fireplace, a rabbit roasting on a spit. "Any sign of trouble?" she asked, accepting the mug of coffee he offered. "None. We left no trail they could follow." He turned the spit. "Eat. Then we will talk about what to do next." The rabbit was lean but flavorful, complemented by wild onions Key had gathered. As they ate, he explained that they were about 15 miles from the ranch, in a remote area rarely visited even by hunters. "How will Yates find us?" Grace asked. "I left signs he will understand." Key pointed to his own chest. "He taught me. I taught him. We speak the same language of the wilderness." Grace nodded, trusting his expertise. "What happens if the mining company men return to the ranch with the sheriff? With a real warrant?" "Then Yates will have to decide if his ranch is worth more than justice." Key's expression was unreadable. "But I do not think this will be his choice." That night, as Grace lay on the cot with Key keeping watch outside, she thought about what he had said. Yates had built his ranch over 5 years, creating something substantial from nothing. Would he really risk losing it all to help her? A woman he barely knew, the thought made her heart ache. She had already cost him peace and safety. How much more would he sacrifice before deciding she wasn't worth the trouble? The next morning brought no answers, but did deliver a welcome surprise. As Grace and Key were finishing a breakfast of cornmeal mush, the distant sound of hoofbeats made them both tense. Key motioned for Grace to stay inside while he slipped out, rifle in hand. Minutes later, Grace nearly cried with relief at the sound of Yates's voice calling her name. She rushed outside to find him dismounting from his horse, Tobias close behind. "You're safe," Yates said, striding toward her with open concern. "Key told me what happened at the ranch. Are you hurt?" "I'm fine," Grace assured him. "Key got me out before they could find me, but what about you? Did you see Judge Hammond?" Yates's face broke into a broad smile. "We did better than that. Hammond reviewed our evidence and issued arrest warrants for the mining company executives on charges of criminal negligence and fraud." Grace gasped. Truly, truly. He was particularly moved by the children's medical records. Turns out his own grandson died of similar symptoms in a mining town back east. Yates reached into his saddlebag and pulled out an official-looking document. He also issued this a writ of protection, ordering that you be brought to Prescott to testify under the court's protection. Sheriff Holloway can't touch you now. Grace took the document with trembling hands. "I can't believe it worked." "It hasn't fully worked yet," Yates cautioned. "This is just the beginning. There will be a trial, and the mining company will hire the best lawyers money can buy. But Hammond is honest and the evidence is strong." "What about your ranch?" "The men who came, let them come again," Yates said firmly. "I have the law on my side now. If Sheriff Holloway returns with a warrant, fine. There's nothing for him to find that I'm ashamed of." Relief flooded through Grace, followed quickly by a wave of emotion so powerful it brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything." Yates stepped closer, his expression softening. "No need for thanks. You did the hard part, gathering the evidence, speaking the truth when no one would listen." Their eyes locked, and Grace became acutely aware of how close he stood, how the morning sun caught in his hair, how his eyes seemed to see straight through to her core. The moment was broken by Tobias clearing his throat. "We should head back soon if we want to reach the ranch before dark." Yates stepped back, his professional manner returning. "Right, let's pack up." The journey back to Eastwood Ranch was tense but uneventful. Every rider they saw in the distance made them wary, but none approached. As they crested the final rise overlooking the ranch, Grace was relieved to see everything appeared normal, no waiting lawmen, no signs of further intrusion. "Home sweet home," Yates said as they rode into the yard. "For now, at least." That evening, after a celebratory meal prepared by Tobias, who, it turned out, was an excellent cook, Yates and Grace sat on the front porch watching the stars emerge. The night was cool but pleasant, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of pine and sage. "When do we need to go to Prescott?" Grace asked. "The preliminary hearing is in 5 days," Yates replied. "That gives us time to prepare your testimony." Grace nodded, her thoughts already turning to the challenge ahead. "The mining company will try to discredit me." "Undoubtedly. They'll call you a hysterical woman, a troublemaker, possibly even suggest you had improper motives." Yates's voice was matter of fact. "We need to be prepared for that." "I'm used to being dismissed," Grace said with a small shrug. "It won't be anything I haven't heard before." Yates turned to look at her directly. "It's different in a courtroom, more personal, more public, and these men have much to lose: their reputations, their fortunes, possibly their freedom. They'll be vicious." Grace met his gaze steadily. "So will I, if that's what justice requires." A slow smile spread across Yates's face. "You know, when I found you in the desert, I thought you were just an unlucky schoolteacher. I had no idea I was rescuing a warrior." Grace laughed softly. "Neither did I." They fell silent, enjoying the peaceful evening and each other's company. After a while, Yates spoke again, his voice thoughtful. "What will you do after the trial, assuming we win?" It was a question Grace had been avoiding. "I don't know. I can't return to Castle Dome, obviously. Perhaps find another teaching position somewhere else in the territory." "You could stay here," Yates said quietly. Grace's heart skipped a beat. "Here?" The Territorial School Board is looking for a teacher for the children at the Chandler Creek Settlement, about 10 miles from here. It's a small school, but the families are good people. You could make a difference there, he paused, and you'd be close enough to visit, if you wanted. The implication hung in the air between them. Grace studied his profile in the moonlight, trying to read his expression. Is that what you want, for me to stay nearby? Yates turned to her, his eyes reflecting the starlight. I think you know it is. Grace's breath caught. We've known each other less than a week. True, but I feel like I've known you much longer. His hand moved across the space between them, coming to rest beside hers on the porch rail, not quite touching. I've never met anyone like you, Grace. Your courage, your conviction, your willingness to risk everything for what's right, those are the same qualities I admire in you, she interrupted softly. Their fingers brushed, then intertwined. The simple contact sent warmth spreading through Grace's entire body. I can't promise anything right now, she said. Not until this case is resolved. There's too much at stake. I understand, Yates replied. I'm not asking for promises, just possibilities. Grace smiled. Possibilities I can offer. The next 5 days passed in a whirlwind of preparation. Yates worked with Grace to anticipate every possible question, every attack on her character or credibility the mining company's lawyers might make. They reviewed her evidence repeatedly, ensuring she could explain each document, each observation, each connection she'd made. Tobias rode to Chandler Creek with a message for Mrs. Wilkins, asking her to bring appropriate clothing for Grace to wear in court. She arrived the following day with not only clothes but the latest news from Castle Dome. The town's in an uproar, she reported as she helped Grace try on a sensible but attractive navy blue dress. Half the miners have walked off the job since word got out about the arrest warrants. The company's bringing in new men, but they're having trouble finding enough who'll work under those conditions now that the dangers are known. What about Sheriff Holloway? Yates asked. Mrs. Wilkins snorted. Strutting around like nothing's happened, but people say the territorial marshal is investigating him too. Apparently, taking bribes from mining companies is frowned upon by the federal government. The news was encouraging, but Yates cautioned against overconfidence. The preliminary hearing is just the beginning. The real battle will be the trial. The day before they were to leave for Prescott, a visitor arrived, Judge Hammond himself, accompanied by 2 U.S. Marshals. Thought I'd save you the trip, he explained as Yates welcomed him into the house. And provide some additional security. The mining company's getting desperate. Judge Hammond was older than Grace had expected, with silver hair and bushy eyebrows, but his eyes were sharp and assessing as Yates introduced her. So you're the troublemaking schoolteacher, he said, though his tone held approval rather than censure. Eastwood has told me about your evidence, but I'd like to hear it from you directly. For the next 2 hours, Grace presented her case to the judge, who listened attentively, asking occasional questions but mostly allowing her to speak without interruption. When she finished, he nodded thoughtfully. Compelling, he said, and your presentation is clear and logical. You'll make an excellent witness. Relief washed over Grace. Thank you, Your Honor. Don't thank me yet, Hammond warned. The Prescott Mining Company has hired Harlan Mitchell from San Francisco. He's a shark, built his reputation destroying witnesses on cross-examination. He glanced at Yates. You've faced him before, haven't you, Eastwood? Yates nodded grimly. Once. He's as good as they say. But he's not infallible, Hammond said, especially when the facts are on your side. He turned back to Grace. Just stick to the truth, young lady. Don't let him rattle you. That night, after the judge and marshals had retired to the guest rooms Yates had prepared, Grace found herself unable to sleep. The magnitude of what lay ahead testifying against powerful men, potentially changing the lives of everyone in Castle Dome, weighed heavily on her. She slipped out of her room and moved quietly to the kitchen, intending to make some tea, only to find Yates already there, staring into a cup of his own. He looked up as she entered. "Couldn't sleep. Too many thoughts," she admitted, taking the kettle he offered. "What if I fail tomorrow? What if Mitchell tears apart my testimony? All those people counting on me." "You won't fail," Yates said with quiet confidence. "You know your evidence, you speak clearly and with conviction, and most importantly, you have truth on your side." "Truth doesn't always win in courtrooms," Grace pointed out. "You of all people know that." "True," he acknowledged, "but it has a better chance when its advocate is as passionate and prepared as you are." He reached across the table, covering her hand with his. "And you won't be alone. I'll be there every step of the way." The warmth of his touch and the steadiness in his eyes calmed her racing thoughts. "Thank you," she said softly, "for believing in me, for believing in this case." "Always," he replied, the word weighted with meaning beyond their immediate circumstances. They sat in comfortable silence, hands still touching, until Grace's tea was finished. Only then did they reluctantly part, returning to their separate rooms to face whatever dreams might come. Morning arrived with a sense of purpose. Grace dressed carefully in the outfit Mrs. Wilkins had brought, a tailored navy dress with a high collar and modest bustle, professional but feminine. She pinned her hair in a simple but elegant style that framed her face without being distracting. When she emerged from her room, Yates was waiting in the hallway, dressed in his best suit, a far cry from the ranch clothes she'd grown accustomed to seeing him in. He looked every inch the lawyer he once was, his normally tousled hair neatly combed, his jaw freshly shaved. "You look beautiful," he said, his eyes warm with admiration. "And you look very lawyerly," she replied with a small smile. "I'll take that as a compliment." He offered his arm. Ready, she took a deep breath and placed her hand in the crook of his elbow. "As I'll ever be." The territorial courthouse in Prescott was an imposing brick building with tall windows and a columned entrance. Despite the early hour, a crowd had already gathered, news of the case against the powerful Prescott Mining Company having spread throughout the territory. Inside, the courtroom was filled to capacity, miners and their families from Castle Dome, representatives from other mining operations, curious townspeople, and a handful of newspaper reporters. At the front, a table was occupied by three expensively dressed men whom Grace assumed were the mining company executives, along with their lawyer, a sharp-featured man with cold eyes who could only be Harlan Mitchell. Judge Hammond entered from his chambers, and the proceedings began. The preliminary hearing was relatively straightforward. The prosecution presented the charges, outlined the evidence, and called witnesses. Grace was the star witness, presenting her meticulously documented records of illness patterns, worker injuries, and environmental contamination. True to his reputation, Mitchell cross-examined her aggressively, attempting to portray her as a naive, emotionally overwrought woman with a personal vendetta against the mining company. But Grace remained calm and articulate, answering each question directly and referring to her evidence when appropriate. "Miss Porter," Mitchell said, his voice dripping with condescension, "you expect this court to believe that you, a schoolteacher with no scientific training, are better equipped to identify patterns of illness than the company's medical doctor." "I expect this court to examine the evidence I've presented," Grace replied evenly. "The dates, the symptoms, the proximity of affected households to the mining runoff, these facts speak for themselves regardless of my qualifications." Mitchell shifted tactics. Is it not true that you were dismissed from your teaching position for insubordination and inappropriate conduct? I was dismissed for speaking the truth about conditions that were harming my students, Grace corrected. If that's considered insubordination, then yes, I am guilty. And isn't it also true that you have developed a personal relationship with Mr. Eastwood, who stands to benefit financially if the Prescott Mining Company's operations are restricted? Grace felt her cheeks warm but kept her composure. My relationship with Mr. Eastwood began after I had already compiled this evidence, and I failed to see how a cattle rancher benefits from mining regulations. From the corner of her eye, she saw Yates suppress a smile. Mitchell's questioning continued for nearly 2 hours, but he failed to shake Grace's testimony or discredit her evidence. When he finally returned to his seat, looking frustrated, Judge Hammond called a recess. In a small antechamber off the courtroom, Yates squeezed Grace's hand. "You were magnificent." "He tried every trick I've seen Mitchell use," Judge Hammond agreed, joining them, "and you didn't fall for any of them." "What happens now?" Grace asked. "I'll issue my ruling after lunch," Hammond said. "But I can tell you unofficially that I'll be ordering the case to proceed to trial. The evidence is too substantial to dismiss." The judge was true to his word. When court reconvened, he formally announced that the case would go to trial in 6 weeks' time. Additionally, he ordered an immediate inspection of the Prescott Mining Company's facilities and operations by territorial officials, and temporary relief for affected families in Castle Dome. As they left the courthouse, Grace was surrounded by miners' wives and parents of her former students, thanking her through tears for standing up for them when no one else would. Several of the miners themselves nodded respectfully as she passed, though they kept their distance, likely fearing retaliation from their employers. One woman pressed something into Grace's hand, a small handkerchief embroidered with forget-me-nots. "You gave my Emma your handkerchief when she was crying on her first day of school," the woman explained. "I want you to have this, to remember that not everyone in Castle Dome turned against you." Tears pricked Grace's eyes as she thanked the woman. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world after months of isolation and rejection. Outside, the U.S. Marshals escorted Grace and Yates to their waiting carriage. "We'll accompany you back to the ranch," one of them explained. "Judge's orders, just in case the mining company gets any ideas." The journey back was subdued but hopeful. Grace was exhausted from the emotional strain of the day, and Yates seemed content to let her rest, his arm occasionally brushing hers as the carriage swayed over the rough road. "What happens next?" she asked as they neared the ranch. "We prepare for trial," Yates replied. "Gather more evidence if possible, identify additional witnesses. The mining company will be doing the same, looking for ways to counter our case." He glanced at her. "It won't be easy and it won't be quick." "I know," she hesitated. "About what Mitchell said about us having a personal relationship." Yates turned to face her fully. "He was fishing for something to discredit you, standard legal tactic." "Yes, but—" Grace gathered her courage. "He wasn't entirely wrong, was he? There is something between us. Something more than just lawyer and client, more than friends." The carriage hit a bump, jostling them closer together. Yates didn't move away. "There is," he agreed softly, "but I didn't want to complicate things for you. You have enough to focus on with the trial." "Life is always complicated," Grace said. "That doesn't mean we should put our feelings aside." Yates studied her face, his expression serious. "Are you sure? Once we go down this path, Mitchell and the mining company will use it against you. They'll claim your testimony is influenced by your feelings for me." "Let them," Grace said with sudden fierceness. "I'm tired of having my words, my choices, my very thoughts controlled by what others might say. That's exactly what I was fighting against in Castle Dome. She reached for his hand. I want to speak freely, Yates, about everything, including how I feel about you. A slow smile spread across his face as he intertwined his fingers with hers. And how do you feel? I think I might be falling in love with you, she admitted, her heart racing. Which is completely irrational given how little time we've known each other. I crossed the line from might be to definitely am 2 days after I met you, Yates confessed. When I watched you organize your evidence with such passion and clarity, I knew I was in trouble. Grace laughed softly. Most men don't find a woman's organizational skills so captivating. I'm not most men. His free hand came up to cup her cheek. May I kiss you, Grace Porter? Yes, she whispered. Please. His lips met hers gently at first, then with growing intensity as she responded eagerly. Grace had been kissed before, but never like this, never with such tenderness and respect combined with undeniable passion. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, the carriage was pulling into the ranch yard. Perfect timing, Yates murmured with a rueful smile. The next 6 weeks passed in a whirlwind of activity. Grace and Yates worked closely preparing for the trial, traveling to interview additional witnesses, collecting more evidence. Word of the case had spread throughout the territory, and other communities affected by mining operations began coming forward with similar stories. Judge Hammond, true to his promise of protection, had assigned a U.S. Marshal to remain at the ranch until the trial concluded. The mining company had indeed tried several tactics to intimidate Grace, from sending men to watch the ranch to attempting to bribe former Castle Dome residents to testify against her. None had succeeded. Through it all, Grace and Yates's relationship deepened. They found moments of joy amidst the preparation, riding together at dawn, reading poetry by lamplight, sharing their dreams and fears under the vast Arizona sky. Grace discovered in Yates a partner who truly valued her mind as much as her heart, who never sought to silence or diminish her. 2 weeks before the trial was to begin, Yates took Grace to Chandler Creek to meet the families whose children she might one day teach. The settlement was small but growing, about 20 families, mostly ranchers and farmers, with a newly built schoolhouse awaiting a teacher. They're good people, Yates told her as they rode back to the ranch. Independent thinkers, they'd welcome someone like you. I like them, Grace admitted, and the children seemed eager to learn. Is it something you'd consider after the trial? Grace smiled. I'm already considering it. Very seriously. The night before they were to leave for Prescott for the trial, Yates asked Grace to walk with him down to the creek that ran through his property. The evening was warm, the sky painted in brilliant oranges and purples as the sun set behind the distant mountains. I've been thinking, Yates said as they stood by the water's edge, about the future, about what happens after the trial. So have I, Grace replied. I think I will take the teaching position at Chandler Creek. I'm glad. He took both her hands in his, but that's not exactly what I meant. Taking a deep breath, he continued, I know it's fast. I know that by conventional standards, we've known each other a very short time. But I also know that what I feel for you is real and lasting. Grace's heart began to race as she realized where this was leading. I love you, Grace Porter. Your courage, your intelligence, your passion for truth and justice, the way you refuse to be silenced or diminished. He released one of her hands to reach into his pocket, pulling out a small gold ring set with a modest diamond. I'm asking if you would consider becoming my wife. Not right away, we can have as long an engagement as you wish, but I want to face whatever comes next with you by my side, as partners, equals. Tears filled Grace's eyes. Are you certain? Your life was peaceful before I came along with all my troubles. Peaceful, yes, but incomplete, he smiled. Besides, I have a feeling life with you will never be boring. Grace laughed through her tears. That's probably true. She looked at the ring, then back at his hopeful face. Yes, Yates, I will marry you, not because I need your protection or your name, but because I love you. Because with you, I can always speak freely. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then drew her into his arms for a kiss that held all the promise of their future together. The trial in Prescott lasted 3 weeks and captivated the entire territory. Grace testified for 5 days, presenting her evidence with the same clear, logical approach that had impressed Judge Hammond at the preliminary hearing. Other witnesses followed minors with respiratory diseases, parents of children with mysterious rashes and stomach ailments, a former company engineer who confirmed Grace's suspicions about contaminated water. Harlan Mitchell fought vigorously, bringing in experts from San Francisco to counter their claims, attempting to discredit witnesses, and yes, making much of Grace and Yates's engagement as evidence of her emotional involvement in the case. But in the end, the evidence was too substantial to dismiss. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning with a verdict against the Prescott Mining Company on all counts. The company was ordered to pay substantial damages to affected families, implement immediate safety measures, and clean up the environmental contamination they had caused. 2 executives were sentenced to prison terms for fraud and criminal negligence. As they left the courthouse after the verdict, Grace was surrounded by well-wishers, former students, minors' families, journalists wanting statements. One young reporter from the Wickenburg paper asked what she planned to do next. "I'll be teaching again," Grace replied with a smile. "At Chandler Creek Settlement." And, she added, her eyes meeting Yates's across the crowd, "I'll be getting married." "To your lawyer," the reporter noted, scribbling in his notebook. "Quite a romantic story, the outspoken schoolteacher and the rancher who told her to speak freely." "That's exactly what happened," Grace agreed, thinking how that simple invitation, "speak freely with me," had changed the course of her life. Sometimes the most powerful words are the simplest ones. 6 months later, Grace and Yates were married in a simple ceremony at Eastwood Ranch. The guest list included Judge Hammond, Tobias and his new wife from Prescott, Key and several members of his family, Mrs. Wilkins, and many of the families from Chandler Creek, where Grace had been teaching since the trial ended. The settlement had welcomed her warmly, appreciating her progressive educational methods and straightforward manner. The children thrived under her care, and the parents respected her integrity, especially after the widely publicized trial that had exposed the mining company's wrongdoing. Yates had expanded his ranching operation, purchasing adjacent land to increase his herd. But he had also returned to law on a limited basis, taking on cases for those who couldn't afford representation, minors, farmers, and others who found themselves facing powerful interests without a voice. Together, they built a life based on mutual respect and honesty. Their home became known as a place where truth was valued, where difficult conversations were welcomed rather than avoided, where people could indeed speak freely. 2 years after their marriage, Grace gave birth to their first child, a son they named Thomas, after Yates's father. As she held their newborn while Yates sat beside her on their bed, his arm around her shoulders, Grace thought about the strange path that had led her here. "What are you thinking?" Yates asked, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I was thinking about Castle Dome," she admitted. "About being forced to leave. At the time, it felt like the worst thing that could have happened." And now, Grace looked down at their son, then up at her husband's loving face. "Now I know it was the beginning of everything good in my life. Being thrown from that town led me straight to you." Yates smiled, the same warm smile that had first given her hope in the desert 3 years before. Then I'm grateful they couldn't tolerate a woman who spoke her mind. Their loss was my immeasurable gain. Ours, Grace corrected gently. Our gain, our life, our future. Always, Yates agreed, kissing her softly. Always ours. As the years passed, Grace and Yates added to their family a daughter, Eleanor, born 3 years after Thomas, and another son, James, 2 years after that. The Eastwood ranch prospered, as did the school at Chandler Creek under Grace's guidance. The mining company case led to new regulations across the territory, protecting workers and the environment. Grace's journal became a template for other communities facing similar situations, and she occasionally traveled to offer testimony or advice when needed, always with Yates's full support. They faced challenges, of course, drought years that threatened the ranch, opposition to Grace's progressive teaching methods from more conservative newcomers to the territory, the normal struggles of raising children and maintaining a marriage in a demanding environment. But through it all, they remained true to the promise that had first drawn them together: to speak freely with each other, to face problems honestly, to value truth above comfort. Their home was filled with books and ideas, with lively debates and heartfelt conversations, with laughter and occasionally tears, but always with the underlying current of respect and love. On their 10th anniversary, Yates surprised Grace with a new addition to their home, a dedicated library with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and comfortable reading chairs. "For my wife who speaks her mind," he said, as he showed her the completed room. "And who has taught our children and countless others to do the same." Grace, moved beyond words, simply held him close. "I never imagined this life," she whispered. "It's so much more than I ever dreamed possible." "It's just the beginning," Yates promised. "We have so many more years ahead." And they did. Years of growth and change, of challenges met together, of children raised to adulthood with the same values of honesty and courage that had brought their parents together. Years of speaking freely and loving deeply in the wild heart of Arizona.